IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, welcome to All Things Policy. In today's episode, we are discussing Indo Pacific Economic Framework. To discuss this recently launched initiative, we have today with us Manoj Kewalramani. Manoj is fellow at Takshila Institution, and he's also chair of Indo Pacific program at the Takshila Institution. Welcome, Manoj.
Thank you, Megha.
So, diving right into Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Manoj, can you tell us, our listeners, about what this initiative is and why it's so important?
Yeah, I don't think you could have started better other than by saying that we must dive straight into the Indo-Pacific. I think the metaphor fits exactly. But right, so essentially, this was announced during President Biden's visit to East Asia, the recent visit to East Asia. This was a long time coming, and in some ways, my initial reaction upon reading the two documents that were released, which is the statement and the fact sheet, was that it's promising, but it's underwhelming. It's promising because it is forward looking. The US is finally putting out economic framework, is finally sort of putting economic policy up front when it comes to its engagement with the Indo-Pacific. Predominantly, the US Indo-Pacific strategy has lacked an economic wing. If you go back to the Trump administration, which is when the construct of the Indo-Pacific became formalized in American foreign policy and national strategy, you saw security being predominantly front and center. You saw also technology and issues related to supply chain resilience being there. But predominantly, the approach is from a security lens. With this framework, you have an economic leg which was sorely lacking. Yet, this is just one small step in a lot more that needs to be done in American engagement in the Indo-Pacific. What we do know so far is that what the two documents tell us is that this is essentially you've brought together a bunch of countries, some of whom are ASEAN countries, although not ASEAN members are in there. You've got Australia, the United States, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei, and subsequently later in the week, Fiji joined the agreement. So you've got these countries who've come together and who are basically saying that they share a commitment to free, open, fair, inclusive, interconnected, and resilient, and secure and prosperous region, and they are going to be trying to build their economies based on certain high standards going forward, and they're going to be talking about how do you do that. So in that sense, it's a framework to look at multiple different domains in which you can cooperate. And so far, there is no binding agreement. We can go into the details going forward, but that's, I think, the one thing to take forward is that it is a framework which, as the document says, is intended to advance resilience, sustainability, inclusiveness, economic growth, fairness, and competitiveness of these respective economies. But so far, there is no binding agreement that puts these economies together on any of the specific domains of trade, supply chains, energy, or so on and so forth.
Okay, so after security and technology, now we have something to look forward to, the economic front of Quad. So when I was reading this, statements and related documents, this mention of steering businesses away from China towards Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also to boost manufacturing and standards and digital. So there are a lot of topics which were touched upon. And also the second thing was the ASEAN countries are also included. Some of the ASEAN countries, as you mentioned, are also included. So do you think that this is a new kind of bloc is emerging in Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I think it's really early to say anything about a bloc. Look, the fact is that China is critical to supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region, right? Most supply chains, China is at the heart of some of these, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. What this framework is saying, however, and some of this is really, really interesting, right? They say that there are 4 key pillars based on which we will engage in sort of high standard exchanges. We'll make high standard commitments. One is connected economy, which includes trade. And under this sort of trade vector, you've also got the digital economy. So that's one thing, right? So all economic activity, trade, digital economy come under one sector. Then you've got things like a resilient economy. Now, this idea of resilience, if you just go back to a few years ago, it starts with this notion of firstly desire to not be overly dependent on one country, because that vulnerability can be then abused or can then be used for coercion or shaping political outcomes in other countries. So you see countries talking about resilience, and that's particularly because of how China has used its economic power in the last 7-8 years, and then this accelerates during the pandemic, right? Amid the pandemic, not just because of political and geopolitical reasons, but also because of economic reasons, right? When you see a shutdown happening in a country, like say what's happened in China in the last 2 months, and there is no clarity on what are the rules for these shutdowns to happen when their caseloads are so small. Is it possible for China to continue to live with this virus at any point of time? All of that creates anxieties amongst major corporations, who then believe that we need to have alternate supply chains. So part of this resilience sort of comes from there, right? It's sort of a designification of your trade change, of your supply chains, but it's also designification not necessarily entirely for geopolitical reasons, right? Then you've got the sort of third aspect of it, which is clean energy, decarbonization, infrastructure, things like that. This is again the cases where you're looking at sort of forward looking domains. You're looking at joint challenges that you face, like climate change. You're looking at renewable energy, and you're looking at setting standards in these, along with setting new technology targets in these things. So that's your sort of third. So in that sense, it's a forward looking thing, which is also looking at providing solutions. So that's not necessarily the creation of a block. It's kind of like seizing the initiative on some of the future sort of drivers of economic growth. And finally, there is a fair economy, which includes a key part of things like taxation and anti-corruption, where you want to set sort of clear rules on money laundering, bribery, and things like that. So none of these elements are essentially a block formation, apart from perhaps the idea of resilience. It's instead, I would sort of look at it as a competitive option and competitive alternative that's being provided to countries in the region, not just because they may worry as they do about vulnerabilities and overdependence on one economy, but also because they do require solutions to problems. Solutions to problems such as how do you coordinate digital economy growth? How do you create standards for governance of digital trade? How do you create standards for governance for e-commerce and things like that? So you do need solutions. And this is, to me, in that sense, this is an effort which has been launched to provide those solutions, and do that in a consultative manner. That said, I think it's really, really difficult to do that. It's not an easy proposition. Unlike sort of an RCEP, which is a trade deal, of which many of these countries who are part of the Indo Pacific Economic Framework are also part of the RCEP. So, but that's a binding trade agreement, which includes things like market access, tariff reduction, things like that. The Indo Pacific Economic Framework at this point of time does not include anything like that, which again is a limitation of it, right? That it's so far, and it's a product of also the politics of some of these things in the United States and also in these other countries.
Uh, okay, so RCP and Indo Pacific Economic Framework are quite different when we consider the binding and non binding nature of these frameworks, right? Is this that?
It's just not the binding and non-binding nature. It's also that the RCEP talks about trade liberalization. It's talking about easing tariffs. It's talking about greater market access and creating a block of freer flow of goods, and goods, not services as much. But the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework today is doing none of that. It's basically a commitment that these countries are making to talk about high standards cooperation across these four different domains. So it is a overarching framework under which you are likely to see sub agreements, for the lack of a better word. Those sub agreements will likely be binding in nature, but that's also not really specified. Those are kinds of things that still need to, they still need to talk about, which is what I said when I began, when I said that, it's great, it's positive, but it's underwhelming in the sense that we've not gotten anywhere. And I think one of the sentences from the statement that was released underscores this, right? And I'll read out the sentence to you. It says, "Today we launch collective discussions toward future negotiations on the following pillars." So it's telling you that there is still a lot of water to flow under the bridge for something to really happen.
Another factor here is, of course, China. And China has expressed quite strong reservations on this initiative. For example, a few days ago, China's foreign ministry spokesperson used quite strong words, saying that United States is pursuing IPF only because they have their own geopolitical interest, and they're not gonna actually follow through on this initiative. And of course, this is their own doing, and those sort of words. So China's reaction has been obviously not positive. Can you comment on this?
For all the criticism from Beijing, and some of it is legitimate criticism, I'm not going to diss that. And I don't think anybody who's part of IPEF should be taking that criticism lightly. In fact, some of it is constructive criticism. When they say that, well, it's not binding, there are no details, and fair enough. I think that's legitimate criticism. Some of it is, of course, an overwhelming amount of it is, of course, China. It is sort of it demonstrates also Beijing's anxiety, and it also demonstrates the fact that China wants to push back, wants this process to fail, because it does see this sort of proposition by the United States as one other pillar and one other aspect of the American so-called containment strategy of China. And like I said, part of it, particularly when it comes to resilient supply chains, is in part sort of de-sinification of supply chains to certain degree. I wouldn't call it decoupling entirely, because that's I don't think that's the objective. But I think to a certain degree, it is about to create resilience so that you are not entirely dependent from an economic perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective. So that I think exists, and I think Beijing recognizes that. When it's always funny when Beijing criticizes some of these things, because at one level it criticizes them as absolutely unsustainable, unworkable. At the same level, it criticizes them so vociferously as containment. It seems like there is a cognitive dissonance in the minds of the Chinese leadership, that at one level they find the US to be absolutely incompetent, at the other level they find them to be absolutely sinister. So that blending between incompetence and sinister approach, I don't know how they do it, but I think it's also mirrored on the American side. Some of the criticism that apart from what you mentioned, that that the Chinese have argued that it's a geopolitical tool. There was an interesting piece today in the People's Daily by Shu Liping, who is from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and she writes about the 5 drawbacks of the Indo Pacific Economic Framework. She basically says that it's a political tool, its sustainability is questionable, and the 5 drawbacks that she writes about are essentially that, look, it talks about principles and standards, but these are going to be led by the United States, which sort of further cements its hegemonic position. And also, these so-called high standards are there to protect American workers, small businesses, owners, and farmers. So this is essentially protectionism. The fact is that we don't know what this is at the moment, because there is so much that is yet to happen. Second thing is that the IPEF benefits has lopsided sort of benefits for Japan and South Korea, and she compares it to the RCEP, saying, look, they will have to give up some degree of economic engagement with China to be part of the RCEP, to be part of the IPEF. But that's not apparent. So again, that criticism is slightly flawed. The third is that she talks about how ASEAN countries, and like I said, some ASEAN countries are part of it. She says that ASEAN countries are worried that IPEF could erode ASEAN centrality. Now, I think that's an interesting point to be made, and I think it's important for us to hear what the other ASEAN countries are saying. But yeah, these two sort of pushes and pulls do put ASEAN in a tricky position. The fourth point that she makes, and which I think is again, it's valid criticism, is that U.S. domestic politics could scuttle IPEF. She argues that at present the political situation in the United States is unstable. This agreement has not been authorized or approved by the United States Congress. It's still unknown whether this will lead to a consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the negotiation cycle for some of these sub-agreements that I spoke about may take 12 to 18 months. And there are many variables for this to happen. I think this is something that the IPEF countries need to keep in mind, and that's why one of my suggestions in what we wrote in our newsletter on Sunday was that it's important for countries in the IPEF to act quickly to come up with some sort of tangible agreements, come up with some sort of early deliverables. You need to have that momentum. Otherwise, there's a very real possibility of negotiations on some of these issues, particularly digital economy, green technology. These sorts of things can drag on. because there are very different stages of economic development that countries in the IPEF are. There are very different domestic sort of priorities. So it can lead to a frustrating process to set up high standards first. So I think it's important to then therefore sort of pick the lowest hanging fruits first, and get some deliverables so that there is a greater buy-in politically by all these countries, and there are some binding agreements to show. So I think that criticism is well taken. I think the last point that she makes is, that this is essentially the U.S. Politicizing, weaponizing, and ideologizing economic issues. This idea of values and standards and all will essentially be used, through human rights and other things on issues like labor and environmental standards to arm twist developing countries. I mean, that's part of negotiation. I don't think higher standards development is something that every country aspires to. I mean, there is a reason why China is looking to be part of the CPTPP. So, this is slightly, not just slightly, this is actually quite facetious to make this argument. I think it's important for all countries to aspire towards high standard negotiations. But again, this is something that the IPF countries need to keep in mind, because these are tricky things that they will have to negotiate, and they will have to arrive at. And the fact that this agreement today, this IPF framework, is so broad and so generic, underscores how difficult some of these negotiations will be. But yet, like I said, it's a positive, it's a start, but you need to act on this quickly, and this can't be, the momentum on this can't be allowed to just drift away.
Yeah, so on this note, we'll take a short break and we'll continue this discussion afterwards.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Dr. Vishaka tells Ashton how it's possible to reverse chronic disease with lifestyle changes. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam meets Sushil Agarwal. He's the founder and director at Ethika Insurance Broking. They talk about the importance of choosing the right health insurance policy. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth talks about comfort zones and how they hinder our growth. On Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka shares 7 super hit tips to manage your finances. And on Hansvani, here's the story Shaheed. It explores whether the respect for a martyr can change based on his caste. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has launched merchandise and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcast website and click on the shop tab and check out the first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media as well. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, wherever you do that, that is really helpful for us. And do remember, you can also check a lot of our shows out on YouTube. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, you get a list of all of our channels. We're also doing a small listener survey, so please do help us out with that. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/survey, it'll help us understand a little bit more about our listeners. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, and Capgemini. Get the future you want. Thank you so much. Without you guys, this wouldn't be possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. I'm Megha Pardhi, and today I have with us Manoj Kewalramani. We are discussing Indo Pacific Economic Framework today. Before break, we discussed briefly about what is this framework and why this is important, how it is different from RCEP, and some key highlights of China's criticism of this initiative. But Manoj, apart from China's kind of fear mongering, or I don't know what you can say, criticism or specters, anxiety, as you said, but there's still a concern of US following through this framework, or US actually doing something about it, because there have been instances, for example, TPP and RCP also, where US initially had expressed interest and then pulled out of it. So, what do you think about this?
Yeah, look, I think the fact is that firstly, this is not something that the US can or needs to pull out of, because it's not a binding agreement. It's a framework for broad set of negotiations across a broad set of areas. So, it's not an agreement which has to be ratified by Congress, which is partly what the Chinese criticism was, right? It's not even an agreement that has to be ratified. It's not binding. But the fact that it's been done in this way underscores the fact that there are anxieties within the United States about what is the appetite within the United States to commit to broad global trade agreements. And we've seen under Trump and subsequently under the Democrats also that the appetite is not necessarily entirely there. yet there is clearly a desire to shape the rules of future economic engagement. And to be able to do that, you have to be on the table. You have to have a give and take with countries. So I think in that sense, this agreement is sort of the, like I said, it's an underwhelming outcome, but it's probably the best case outcome. What will matter is not just for the United States, but also countries in the region to acknowledge that there has to be give and take on some of these things. For countries in the region to come together to actually agree on certain baseline aspects of, say, the digital economy, certain baseline aspects of decarbonization. Some of that has to happen. So it's not just the United States' responsibility alone, although it's the biggest economy, within this grouping, but others too. If you feel that you want to have an economic stake, in the sort of future, economy of the world, if you want to have a stake in that, and if you want to be able to set the rules, and you don't want a country like China to set the rules to capture markets, then you have to make some sort of compromises. And I think it's incumbent on all these countries to do that. The fact that this IPEF is not a broad based agreement, so that it's not like if you signed on to one aspect, you signed on to every aspect, and that's binding, allows room for you to agree on some things, disagree on others, which again is useful, right? India can agree on some aspects of, say, the digital economy, but disagree on some aspects of something else. And India can not only just agree on, but India can actually shape the rules on, say, money laundering, while it may disagree on something to do with the digital economy. So it allows you that degree of sort of freedom to be able to do that. So in that sense, it's something that a country like India would prefer, right? It's one of those loose, informal thing which gives you a big framework. And what that's shown is that it's allowed, it creates a space for India to negotiate without it feeling like it's caught in a bind. Secondly, for the longest time, I think, and again, I'm talking from an Indian perspective, for the longest time, we've made the argument that India needs to be at the table to make the rules. This is an opportunity to be at the table to make the rules. When the TPP negotiations were launched, India was not part of that. Today, you are at the table. Today, geopolitics has provided you the opportunity that you're at the table to shape the rules. It'll mean tough give and take. All negotiations are gives and takes. So you'll have to play that role. But it's an opportunity for India to shape the rules, and not just bilaterally, multilaterally, for the broad region comprising East Asia, South Asia, Australia, these regions. I mean, it's an opportunity for you to do that, for you to play a big, major international role. So I think it should be welcome, and the trade-offs should be thought through. And you can make some of those trade-offs. You're not, and you're making that trade-off with like-minded countries, which is what you have wanted to do. So this is geopolitics creating an economic opportunity for India, and I think it's important in that sense.
So, in some aspects, it's like a quad, which has again informal structure to accommodate different interests, right?
Yeah, in some aspects, it is. It is sort of like, so. The Quad has a not a the difference that I would say is that the Quad doesn't necessarily have a clear agenda. In the sense that its agenda has evolved over a period of time, right? It didn't sort of come into being with one clear agenda. It was a very broad-based agenda of all of them agreeing on a free and open Indo-Pacific. Yet our definitions of what free meant, what open meant, and perhaps even what the Indo-Pacific meant were very different, right? So India's free and open Indo-Pacific usually tends to always have this other word called inclusive, which the United States doesn't necessarily. What does freedom mean? Freedom from an Indian point of view also means the freedom to choose. From the American point of view, freedom perhaps meant something very different. It meant more akin to the political system of democracies and freedom of thought and those sorts of things. So the Quad has been a process of harmonizing these understandings and then identifying an agenda which is today very broad, from vaccines to supply chains to 5G to space and to fellowships and things like that. In the Indo Pacific Economic Framework, you've got a framework which is touching on some broad domains. And those are much more clearly defined, right? Supply chains of critical emerging sort of products and things like that, resilience. You've got trade and digital economy. You've got decarbonization and green technologies. You've got corruption, tax issues, and things like that. So you've got a little bit more clarity on the set of areas that you will agree upon and you can work upon. But what the outcomes will be on those areas is a process of negotiation, and that's how it's left it, which is unlike what the Quad had. I think it's useful. I think to just go back to the original point, credit where credit is due. It's great that we finally got this out. It's really interesting to listen to American officials talk about this not as an us versus them choice against China, but as wanting to pitch the United States as a partner of choice for countries in the region. And it's great that in that process there is this fluidity to this framework where there is still lots to be negotiated. But the challenge is that if you don't do some of these things quickly, it can end up becoming irrelevant. And I think that's what you need to guard against.
Okay, so this framework, how do you think this framework will shape Indo-Pacific in future?
Yeah, like I said, I think it has the potential to shape it in a direction where there will be a much more prosperous region with much more competitive economies, with different options, with hopefully countries getting the option of partnering with like-minded states, developing better, more sort of open law-based systems which where you can operate, as opposed to potentially, and obviously countries becoming and economies becoming much more resilient. The other alternative is, of course, that this is much ado about nothing, and some of the more difficult things you are unable to agree upon, and those discussions on common standards frustrate actual investment, because companies wait for arriving at for getting policy clarity, and because of that their investment decisions maybe get delayed or whatever, and you therefore see fewer investment decisions being taken, fewer joint projects being carried out. Some of those things happen because there is policy uncertainty, and at the same time you see Chinese companies essentially not necessarily bothered about setting high standards, but actually interested in investing and capturing markets because that's economically sensible. Capturing markets and then having greater influence, and the Chinese government having greater influence. So there are both those possibilities. It all depends on how quickly some of these, conversations on standards can be concluded, and you can arrive at clarity, not vague things, and you can arrive at sort of some common understandings, which is a difficult task. So I'm not saying that that's easy to do. The fact that it's not been done so far, and the fact that this document says things like, we will talk further, tells you that how difficult that task is going to be. The fact that it's not been put to the US Congress tells you about the appetite within the United States. But again, that said, I'm hopeful that over the next 12 months, 18 months, we will see some sort of much more tangible action, which can create a much more competitive and thereby prosperous Indo-Pacific region. If not, I think we are down a trajectory which is going to be much more competitive, with China's rise becoming much more potentially challenging.
Okay, so interestingly, Fiji recently decided to join Indo Pacific Economic Framework, and I was wondering if, with Fiji joining, and this came same around the same time when Wang Yi is also visiting Fiji and Pacific countries. So I was wondering if US through this framework can actually counter China's economic influence in that region.
I think that, like I said, there is a geostrategic and geopolitical component to this, right? And that is that to be able to provide countries with alternatives to Chinese money, which we have seen leads to adverse political influence by Beijing. So, and historically, in the last few years, you've seen developing countries make the argument, and legitimately so, make the argument saying, look, my constituents want a better life. My citizens want a better life. We need investments in infrastructure and all sorts of things. If you're not giving it to us, where are we going to get it from? And if somebody is coming with investment, why will I say no at the end of the day? Now, there are political risks to some of this investment, but at the end of the day, as a politician, if I have infrastructure goals, if I have developmental goals, I need capital for it. I will accept capital and I will make the trade-offs that I need to make. Obviously, making a trade-off with sovereignty is another matter, but I don't think we have seen anybody really make a trade-off with sovereignty, because when we make that argument, we end up diminishing the agency of some of these other smaller states. These are countries with smart leaders who know what they are doing. They make bad decisions, they make good decisions, but they know that they are hedging their bets and they know that they have certain objectives. So it's a positive thing that a country like Fiji has come on board after the agreement was announced, and while Wang Yi is in the region. It sends a message to Beijing that that the America is leading a sort of economic competitive partnership. But again, the depth of that partnership is something that time will tell.
Interesting. Yeah, I did remember that one of the readout of fact sheet from Chinese ministry was that we have initiatives and cooperation with Pacific countries without political strings attached, and this kind of
Of course, they do.
Yeah.
Of course they do. Of course they do. It's just like how I eat chocolate, never put on weight.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was quite an interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today, Manoj.
Thank you.
Yeah. See you soon.
Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Habits? Routines? How exactly do they help us get better? Well, to simplify it for you, tune in to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashton Doctor and I'm going to be here to help you get better daily with some simple, easy to do habits that you can easily adapt to your life. So tune in to the Habit Coach podcast from Monday to Friday because I believe that awesome lives start with awesome habits.